Today we are at the 28th Annual St. Lucie County History Day competition at Indian River State College in Fort Pierce. We have students from across our county showcasing all of their hard work of a history topic of their choice for this year's theme of triumph and tragedy. All in total, we have 186 projects this year, and we are so proud of all the hard work that they have done. Looking forward to see who's going on to the state competition in Tallahassee, which will be held at the beginning of May.
Hi, my name is Samuel Hall. I go to Fort Pierce Central High School. I did my project on the triumph and tragedy of King Tut's treasure. I wanted to do this project because of my love for just Egyptian history in general, and in particular Tutankhamun. The original, when they found it, they didn't find the tomb itself. They found an embalming cache. Theodore Davis was the guy that found it. It was found in 1909, which led to the discovery of the tomb itself by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon. The embalming cache was actually found about 190 yards away from the tomb itself. These are the examples of the stuff found in embalming cache. Over here is pictures of them getting into the tomb itself. They did CT scans and x-rays of this king when they found him. Originally they thought he was murdered, but eventually turned out he was not. He died from an infection from an open fracture in his leg.
My name is Charity Pass, and I go to Treasure Coast High School, and my project is on Jackie Robinson. The triumph and tragedies of Jackie Robinson is him basically going through a lot throughout his baseball experience. He received a lot of hate, and many people didn't like the fact that an African American was playing with an all-white team. And to overcome that, he showed them his talents, his skills, and basically showed him everything that he can do. And later on, people started to accept him in the baseball industry. He influenced a lot of people today, and he changed a lot throughout the history of baseball.
Hello, my name is Jaden Mullen.
My name is Adrian Rivera.
My name is Christopher Maxon.
My name is Christian Maxon, and we all go to Southern Oaks Middle School.
Okay, so our project, King Tutankhamun Triumph and Tragedies, relates to the theme of the history fair because King Tutankhamun had a lot of triumph and tragedies throughout his life.
Some triumphs in his life is that his tomb was left nearly intact for almost 3,000 years, and that most of his treasures were found in his tomb. And science can learn a lot about his tomb and how people lived back in the early 1500s of BCE.
Some of the things that were in his tomb were his walking sticks, his stillborn children, food vessels, and his golden mask and golden jewelry.
Some tragedies about King Tutankhamun is that he died at such a young age and he never got to experience life. He had all these disabilities that he could not do, and he died at such a young age.
One tragedy is that he suffered from many different diseases such as clupophile, scoliosis, and he had a clubbed foot. Also, while discovering King Tutankhamun's tomb, Howard Carter broke his body into 33 different pieces.
Hello, my name is Danielle Figueroa. I'm from Okemik KA School. My project is on El Grito de Lares. The reason why I chose this project was because that's where my whole family is in Puerto Rico. So it all started when Christopher Columbus came into Puerto Rico and claimed it as Spanish territory, and then brought more Spaniards into the island and put the Taíno Indians that were already on the island to work for the basic needs like tobacco, sugar cane, coffee. As soon as more Spaniards came in, a lot more Taíno Indians were dying and mixing with the Spanish. So then they started bringing enslaved Africans into the country too, to work for the basic needs. And then, which basically led up to El Grito de Lares, which was a rebel against Spain. It was at nighttime, and when Spain came marching into Lares, Puerto Rico attacked Spain, and then Spain moved on to the next town. Soon after that, they went to go after Spain, and Lares got taken over, which then later on leads to the Spanish-American War, where Americans came in. If Ramon Betances would have never been stopped by the Dominican Republic, the Spanish-American War may or may have not happened, because he had a ship full of French allies.
I'm Vicky.
I'm Alison.
I'm Gabriela.
I'm Jennifer. We come from Northport. The terms are that Simon Bolivar liberated 5 nations: Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. He wrote the Cartagena Manifesto. He fought in 472 battles. The tragedies were that he suffered the death of his wife, Maria Teresa del Toro, and in 1803, and the death of his best friend, Sucre.
He really wanted a democratic government in that country. And an example of what he didn't want in a country is my country, Venezuela. Venezuela now have a narco-trafficking government, dictator government, and that government separated my family, and it's separating a lot of families. People in Venezuela is dying because they can't find food or medicines. So a lot of these countries are helping them. I really think the United States took care of me and my family and their family. So yeah, his project was have a pro-independence and civil freedom.
Luke Sparkman. Nick Manganero.
Allison Deweese, and we're at Treasure Coast High School.
Well, this is the Vietnam War, which started due to communism. The North and South Vietnam originally was just between them. The U.S. intervened because they wanted to stop the spread of communism, and they feared that it would be a domino theory, which would cause multiple countries to become a communist state. It was unsuccessful though. It didn't, even though we spent $168 billion and 3 million lives were lost total, 58,000 Americans. It wasn't successful, and it just ended up becoming one communist state, no longer like a split between South and North Vietnam.
I'm going to talk about the Viet Cong and how they used it to their advantage. They would use the guerrilla warfare to blend in and you put traps, and then the USA, they used their Agent Orange to spray down gases, and when they did that, it hurt all the crops and their own players, enemies, and their team. And they used machine guns and tanks and all that.
And so I'm going to be talking about the economy and stuff, but the U.S. economy was greatly damaged by this U.S. Vietnam War, along with how the North Vietnam and South Vietnam, they were the first war, and then out of nowhere, our economy in the U.S., they felt bad and they didn't want the communists to spread. So Lyndon B. Johnson was the president at the time in the United States, and he pretty much raised the taxes in America so we can help afford the $168 billion that we put into the Vietnam War to eventually lose. But the protests that were held in the United States was like a great example of how the Vietnam War was a triumph, because they pretty much helped, like, showing their freedom of speech helped Vietnam realize that, oh, this communist isn't okay, so it helped them fight in the war for more.
My name's Kashelle Cannanoy.
My name's Harrison Pierre-Lewis.
And we go to Fort Pierce Central High School. We did our project on Genghis Khan about cartography and power. It relates to this year's theme about triumph and tragedy, because cartography is using the knowledge of the land to your advantage over your enemies. So having that knowledge is how you're able to triumph over your enemies, which is what Genghis Khan did.
And who Genghis Khan is he was the leader of the Mongolian Empire, and he was such a well-known person that he earned the title of Genghis Khan, which translates to universal ruler. And why we believe that he became, or had the drive to become a Mongolian leader, is because in his childhood, the nomadic tribes were always fighting, and there was never a time of peace. So he desired to make to build an empire where there was order and law, and the raping of his mother and kidnapping of his mother, as well as the killing of his father, made him feel like these laws needed to be put in place to develop a form of order.
Genghis Khan took over large chunks of China and Central Asia, and his ruling lasted from 1178 to 1227. So it lasted about 49 years. However, his descendants did continue their reign until the 14th century.
And this map is to visualize like the where he conquered, and the purple arrows are the routes he took. And the Great Wall was made in major part, or like he was a major reason as to why it was made, because they wanted to prevent him from entering in, because he was a danger at the time, a severe threat. And why this is important, because he introduced a new method, a new battle method where future empires would try and use to battle with, as well as he introduced a new postal system, new writing system, and he united the nomadic tribes, and he conquered twice as much land than any other ruler in history.
We also included a catapult, which is one of the techniques that he had used to conquer his enemies, and we included a mountain and pictures to give a visual, because he would use a mountain because having a higher standpoint on the mountain gave him advantage to attack from above on his enemies. And we included pictures to show like the battle of what was happening on the mountain.
These students have been working on their topics. It's almost the first week of school where we start introducing the theme, which is tragedy and triumph this year. And they start to find topics that interest them, which is the most important part, because you want to find something that's close to you and you can relay it and really have this desire to do the research and pull it out and present it to the judges.
Hi, I am Christopher Villa.
I'm Samuel Tejada.
I'm Ellie Sinius.
Of Samuel's Gaines.
Samuel's Gaines.
Okay, so our project is the Spanish Inquisition. So a little background was, before the Spanish Inquisition, there was a French Inquisition that influenced Ferdinand to come up with his awful and dreadful thought of making Spanish Inquisition. So basically to outlaw heresy and to torture people, mostly Jews and Muslims, for not having the same beliefs as them. So also another thing is that almost everything that happened in the Spanish Inquisition happened in the French Inquisition. So that just means that Ferdinand thought it was a good idea to copy the French Inquisition and make it its own, basically.
The Spanish had a little summary is that the Spanish had an Inquisition and it was devastating to all the non-Catholic people. Below are some questions and an explanation to the questions in the form of summary. There is also some information we found that explains the Spanish Inquisition and the aftermath.
Today, the Spanish Inquisition has taught us people that it is fine to believe in our beliefs, and we should be accepted in this society, no matter what we believe in. This is important in history because without this main event, people could still be dying till this day because of what they think or believe. Christians and Jews and Muslims were mostly affected by the Spanish Inquisition. During the Spanish Inquisition, about 2,000 people died and 5,000 were prosecuted. People who did not believe Catholicism were convicted of heresy, and the consequence of committing heresy were death or torture.
Okay, so basically the build-up of all of this was, so the main people hosting the Inquisition was Ferdinand and Isabella, and they prepared by basically getting more followers, and eventually they got the government to think that having one religion and punishing people who didn't believe in it was a good idea. Most of the events rising to this event was multiple riots and fighting and mobs protesting for the Spanish Inquisition. Most of the life before the event was just like regular places and a lot more Jews and Muslims.
Another summary is that the Muslims took over Spain for a while and left in 1492. A few years before that, the king and queen asked the Pope to sign a papal bull, which is something like a public decree for the Inquisition to start. It was horrible to so many people because they died and they were tortured. Fast forward a couple of years, Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Spain and demolished the Inquisition for a few years. When Spain overthrew him and brought back the Inquisition for a while until somebody came and during the reign of Queen Isabella and just destroyed it forever.
After the Inquisition, more people were confident to express what they believed. The tragedy was that Catholic Churches killed Jews and Muslims and other non-believers because they didn't believe in what they did. Conclusion: the Spanish Inquisition ended when Napoleon Bonaparte took over Spain and abolished it.
Hello, my name is Hadi Hindi, and my project was on the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles, how it was a triumph and a tragedy, it was triumphant because it ended World War I and the conflict between the Allied powers in Germany. But it was a tragedy because it ended, like, the Nazis, they still came back and caused fatal destructions in World War II. So the Treaty of Versailles was a peace agreement that triumphantly ended the war between the Allied powers and Germany, but initiated the tragedy of World War II. The Treaty of Versailles was triumphant by ending World War I. Without the tragedy, World War I could have lasted a way much longer time. This treaty brought peace between the Allied powers and Germany. The treaty was able to maintain peace in the event of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was a triumphant because it ended World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was tragic because of the huge amount of deaths and pressure that gave the rise to the Nazis in World War II. After the end of World War I, the Nazis were still determined to come back. The destruction that the Nazis caused in World War II was catastrophic. The Treaty of Versailles was tragic because it let the Nazis come back and start again in World War II. So these are just pictures I have here. There's a timeline, quotes, and there's bigger versions of here. This is what the Treaty of Versailles looked like, or at least the front of it. In conclusion, I learned new information from reading and learning about the Treaty of Versailles. The major event is important to learn and understand the events of World War I and World War II. It's an important part in world history. The Treaty of Versailles was signed so it can bring peace throughout all countries involved. An effect of this was loss of German territories. This action caused triumph. Many years later, the Germans were ready to come back to go to war. This rise led to the Germans invading Poland and many other countries. This was tragedy. The Treaty of Versailles may have caused triumph, but it also caused tragedy.
I'm JC. I'm Shelby, and we go to Lincoln Park Academy, and we're in the 6th grade. The tragedy of Ford Motor Company assembly line was in 1932. There was a Ford Hunger March, and that caused many deaths and injuries, and that was also during the time of the Great Depression, which is when people lost a lot of their jobs. But the triumph of the Ford assembly line was that during the Hunger March, during the end of the Hunger March, they let out the model called the Ford V8, and it sold very well because Henry Ford priced them in the perfect way to where they sold many of them and they got a lot of profit from them. Also, during the Great Depression, when a lot of people lost their jobs from Ford, they gained them back during the end when they were selling the cars, and they got double the people that they lost.
Hi, I'm Aaliyah Woods. I'm Presley Harari.
Tatiana Martinez, and we go to Centennial
High School.
Our
Exhibit is on Vincent van Gogh. He was a famous artist that became famous after his death, and he was successful and created many of his paintings from his emotions, and most of his emotions were like depressing, like he felt neglected in many ways. There's a lot of triumphs and tragedies due with this exhibit.
Okay, so yeah, Vincent van Gogh, everyone knows him, the crazy artist that cut off his ear. So we wanted to go more in depth and find out about his life. So Vincent van Gogh, from an early age, was just sad, and he didn't have a good life. He tried to become a preacher, that didn't work. He tried to get with his cousin, that didn't work. Then he tried to get with a prostitute, that didn't work either. So his love life was a failure, his job was a failure, so he turned to the art world, and he went to live with his older brother in Paris and just completely self-taught. He tried paintings, and his first painting was a complete failure. It was just dark and no one liked it, so he realized he needed to use vibrant colors, and he just created over 2,000 paintings, but none of them would become famous until after he died. He only sold one painting while he was alive, and that was right before he ended up shooting himself. So yeah, he killed himself at the age of 37. And then after that, he became successful, which she'll explain.
One of Van Gogh's most triumphs is that he did not succeed in the art world until he died, and that's also a tragedy. But another triumph is that he developed his own style in Impressionism, and he has his own unique way that he strokes his brushes or paints or whatever, and
Yeah, there's a museum in Amsterdam all about him, and his works are famous all over the world. One of them sold for over $100 million. So
he became successful after his death, but people have been inspired to express their emotions through paintings and artwork because of Vincent van Gogh.
Yeah.
I think that what's so awesome about this opportunity is that, for young people, if you're not intentionally watching the news or paying attention to what's going on around you, you'll miss a lot. And so I feel like events like these really help our young people to draw in what's happening around them and to really tune into how that impacts me in my life. And it helps them to really recognize what came before me. And I just think that that's awesome, because it's not something that they would necessarily pay close attention to had they not had this opportunity to really dive into who was here before me and how have these moments impacted where I am today and where my family is today.
My name is Randir Bisram. I go to Somerset College Prep, and I did my project on Galileo Galilei, aka the father of observational astronomy. And I chose him because I thought that he heavily related to the triumphs and tragedies topic. In the triumphs, he discovered many things about space and astronomy, such as the four moons of Jupiter. He also made improvements on the telescope, aka his modern telescope, which is shown here. And he also basically was a first form of rebellion, so people can look up to him for that. And he also taught us that change is inevitable and change will happen, and rather than fight it, you should try and at least open your mind to it. And his tragedies were that rather than nurture his talents and understand that his discoveries could make a big impact, he was shunned upon by the church due to the fact that the church had a kind of a powerful grip around Europe at that time, and they punished him by sentencing him to house arrest for the rest of his life. And during his house arrest, he ended up going blind, and he passed away 10 years after. And Galileo has left us with incredible discoveries and has allowed us to expand more and more every single day. And if it wasn't for him, science and technology would probably be held back hundreds of years because of it.
So my name is Lila Kaiser from Oakhammock K-8 school. My project is about the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The owners of the 10-story building were Max Planck and Isaac Harris. They owned the top 3 floors and employed 500 people who were women, men, and children who sewed women's blouses at the time that were called shirtwaists. The shirtwaist was in style that time, around that era, but was soon going out of style. This fire started when some people believed that someone dropped a cigarette into a scrap clothing basket. The fire ignited too quickly for people to put out, so the 8th floor workers contacted the 10th floor workers so they could try to get out soon. They tried to contact the 9th floor workers, but their phone was not working at the time. So while the 8th and 10th floor people fled while they still had time, 9th floor people were trapped. So the 9th floor people were trying to get out, but the elevator shut down because of the weight, because it was one by one. And they tried to go to the fire escape, but it soon melted due to the weight. And they tried to go through the stairway, but it was locked because the owners did not want people stealing the clothes there or exiting for smoke breaks not during their break time that they had. So while this was happening, they contacted the firemen to put out the fires, but their hoses did not reach to the 9th, 8th, or 10th floors. So after that happened, they changed the conditioning laws. While that fire only took 15 minutes, it changed so many conditions for factory workers. It changed unfair wage laws. It changed child labor laws. It changes the scrap bins so they could pick it up so none of this could happen ever again. And it changed a lot for these factory people's lives.
I'm Heather.
I'm Laura.
And I'm Allison, and we're from Northport K-8. Our project is about the triumph and tragedy of smallpox.
The tragedy of smallpox was that it killed 1/3 of the population in the 18th century and left people blind, unable to move, and with scars all over their bodies.
The triumph of smallpox was that a doctor named Edward Jenner made vaccinations that were the foundation of other vaccinations that we have today.
There are smallpox in laboratories in high security laboratories in US and Russia.
Patients with smallpox would be put in isolation so they wouldn't give other people with smallpox because it was a very contagious disease.
What's this thing? Oh, the last person to have smallpox was Ali Maui Malin, and that was in 1977.
Hi, my name is Noah Lehmann, and my school is Palm Point, and I'm a 6th grader. And I'm doing a monologue on Alexander Hamilton. 1772. A hurricane changed my home forever. It was a long, loud, and dreadful night the storm hit. My Caribbean island was virtually destroyed. I was essentially homeless. For a moment, in the eye of that hurricane, I found quiet. And to this day, every time I see a yellow sky, it reminds me of that day when I was only 17. But I wrote my way out. I wrote my way all the way to New York. I looked up and the city had its eyes on me. They helped me. Total strangers, moved to kindness by my story. Raised enough money for me to book a ticket on a New York-bound ship. I wrote my way out of St. Croix that day. I wrote my way to revolution and to law school. I had a passion to never stop writing, and I always worked for what was right to be done. I worked the best I could at King's College. I worked until I could not put any more into my head. Later in life, I fell in love. But Eliza only fueled my passion for writing more. I wrote Eliza love letters every day until she could only say yes to loving me. But who wouldn't? We married later and I had a wonderful son. A son just like me, Philip. I wrote about the Constitution and defended it well. I wrote the Federalist Papers and went from an outsider to an insider in George's army. And in the face of defeat and lack of knowing its social resistance, I wrote our way out. I created America. I created and moved America forward. I wrote systems into place as what we now know as our financial systems. I wrote them into existence. I triumphed in my successes to the point where my tragedies were almost silenced. Almost. However, your mind never forgets. My son gave his life defending my name. I almost lost my marriage over disloyalty and selfishness. I will never forgive myself for these things. And I will always think of my mother holding me the day the hurricane took her from me. God did not take me that day for some reason. He wouldn't let me die. And though I will not always understand this, when my prayers to God were met with friction and storms from above, I wrote and looked for quiet. And you know what? In the eye of the hurricane, there's always quiet and a yellow sky. That's it.
So my name is Neve Janke. I go to St. Andrew's Episcopal Academy, and my topic was Matthew Shepard. I wanted to talk about him because I thought his life really showed triumph and tragedy extremely well. He was a gay male that was murdered on October 6, 1998, and although his family and his community was affected extremely negatively, his parents wanted to make a change. So they started working on the Hate Crime Prevention Act, which was passed in 2009 by President Obama. This Hate Crime Prevention Act protects religion, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, and religion. So, and it was able in those 10 years to protect 13,523 cases. So I think that his life shows extreme triumph and tragedy.
Hi, I'm Kaylee True.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Sesa, and we go to Somerset College Prep.
And so for our project, we did Pompeii, Tragedy and Triumph. And for the tragedy of our project, it was that Mount Vesuvius, a gigantic volcano, blew up in 79 AD. And so, for the tragedy, the entire city was covered in 9 feet of ash. There was a bunch of people died trying to escape Pompeii. They were hit by flying debris trying to run out. But before it happened, they actually had time to escape. But the people that stayed, it ended up being fatal choice, and they were burned by the ash, and people trying to escape were actually hit by flying debris and could not breathe because of all the ash, and they could not see.
The triumph of Pompeii would be definitely the amount of tourists that come due to all the archaeological sites that they have, and the fact that they bring in so much money from it. In 2010, the first 10 months of 2010, they brought in $23.8 million, and approximately 2.3 million people visit it every year. Now, since the ash preserved the whole city, it acted as a time capsule for everything. So it preserved people, preserved animals, it preserved the foods they ate, like nuts, sea urchins, meat, everything, pots, pans, art. It preserved everything in the city, so we got to see how they lived back then and what they did and cool stuff like that.
Yeah. And so the art that we found from Pompeii, like that was actually covered in ash, they found this piece of art right here in a house. And as you can see, the woman is holding a stylus, which leads to the belief that women back then were of high knowledge in Pompeii, which wasn't very common. Like in Greece, their counterparts, women were usually not very well educated, which was very well known. And you can see how she's standing in front of her husband, and that means that her knowledge was valued inside of that family. So, yeah.
Something that correlates with the painting and how she said how the red represents wealth. A lot of rich people would go to Pompeii on holiday. So, yeah. And then the geological features of Pompeii, it's located around here, and it's approximately 14 miles away from southeast Nepal, and going over to Pliny the Younger.
So Pliny the Younger was actually one of the very few eyewitnesses that we have for Pompeii, the eruption of it. And so Pliny the Younger had an uncle called Pliny the Elder. And Pliny the Elder was a naval ship general. And so they were staying by an island close by at the time. And when they saw that Pompeii started to erupt, you can see that there, yeah. So Pliny the Elder, he went over with the naval ships trying to save the inhabitants, but doing so he passed away. And Pliny the Younger he wrote about what he saw, and they have a quote right here.
From his journal.
It says, generally appearance can be best expressed as being like an umbrella of pine, for it rose to great heights on a sort of trunk and then split into branches. I imagine it because thrust upwards by the blast and then unsupported as the pressure subsided, or else it was domed down by its own weight, so that it spread out and gradually dispersed. In places that looked like white, elsewhere it looked like blotched and dirty. That was Pliny the Younger's quote.
So, right here, just something that correlates with it. It's the highest point of the volcano and what it looked like, and it correlates to what that journal entry was.
And for another thing for the triumph, Pompeii is actually one of the biggest archaeological sites in the world at 150 acres. And we can see right over here on this picture right here, it kind of correlates with, you can see how the archaeological person right here, and you can see how it's similar. And right here, it's actually the same place.
So this is the older picture, and this is the newer picture, the newest picture that they have, and it's the same area. And I find it fascinating how the ash was able to preserve the city streets, and the mosaics that they had on their floor of the city, and over here, how this was able to be preserved. I find that so fascinating.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
So the purpose of History Day is for students in middle school and in high school to come together to present their findings on, it could be historical figures or moments in time that have captivated their interest. And so they conduct research to better understand what its impact on history was, or that particular person's impact on history was, and then they present it to judges in their findings and its relevance today.
Okay, so my name is Vino. I'm from Port St. Lucie High School, and mainly my project is mostly about W.E. Du Bois and the NAACP and the foundation and the formation of it. So to start with is my tragedy. A lot of laws during this time, such as Jim Crow laws, were actually being formed to restrict African Americans' full capabilities of a citizen. And during this time, I wanted to know why these laws were being passed, even though people weren't able to counteract with their actual speech, because during this time African Americans, they didn't have the education that they needed to speak up for themselves. So I actually wondered and talked about why Jim Crow laws were actually a term in newspapers that showed up during the early 1900s, that African Americans shouldn't be have same equality and same equal rights that other people have in the world. So I was discussing about the tragedy and how since these laws were being passed, African Americans weren't able to fully explain why they couldn't pass these laws. So what they did was came up with organizations such as the NAACP and movements such as the Niagara movement, which were boosting the encouragement and actually showed the involvement and produced more involvement of African Americans. So I explained why right here, up here, and talking about why the African Americans were actually, they came to agreement that the Niagara movement should be a movement where African Americans and their involvement should be more enforced to why we should fix these equal rights or unequal rights and fix the injustice that we have. And so amendments, even the amendments, the 13th and the 14th were passed. These laws are trying to wrap around them and actually restrict access from the African Americans. So I was actually discussing that the tragedy and all the tragedy and tragic moments in this event were actually the intimidation and the deaths and the actual killings of African American people and the mobs that were being set, such as lynchings, which were actually mobs that were non-judicial, which means the government cannot actually federally say that these are right and that you can do this, because even if you're an innocent African American, you could have still been hung or even burnt alive if you were just being prosecuted about something you didn't even do. So I discussed more about W.E. Du Bois and why he was more of a pioneer during this time, because he was able to produce many influential writings and influential letters that he sent to many different people, and that he was able to discuss about African American rights and how in our community we need to fix a lot of problems that we are facing. And so he used forms of books, he used forms of letters, and he also created a magazine line that he founded, which was called The Crisis, which has up to 25 volumes, which was also a way to push forth the involvement of the NAACP, because they were able to talk about more of the problems that they were facing during this time, because this takes place mostly during the 1800s, late 1800s, and the early 1900s. And so I mostly discuss near at the bottom about in the triumph was that the maps were actually maps shown, but the events prior were the American Revolution. The American Revolution was between the Confederate and the Union, mostly discussing about if slavery was a good thing or a bad thing. And later they learned that it was a bad thing. So I mostly talk about my maps and mostly show that the ex-Confederate states were actually not agreeing to the fact that segregation should be stopped and equal rights was not a thing like they wanted to have. So the Union tried to protect that right and tried to protect those amendments and tried to fight against the Confederate. But this led to a war, and this led to a lot of the different changes that were going on and the laws being passed that were restricting African Americans' full capabilities. But I dug deeper into the information and found that W.E. Du Bois was actually a very, very intelligent man. He was intellectual because he was one of the first to actually graduate from Harvard College and actually get a doctor's degree and actually teaching the histories of sciences and mathematics and different types of classes. And he was able to show and produce that in the African American community they should give more of a production of equal rights that they needed. And I mostly discussed that and say in my conclusion that this, and the significance in my conclusion that this is more of the reason why a lot of these events literally deciphers how we live today, because in today's world I probably wouldn't be able to stand and talk to a lot of the people I want to talk to, or we will still be segregated to this day. So that's mostly what I'm discussing. And one moment that was a new thing to me that I learned was that even though the NAACP is a big formation, not that many people understand the fact that it wasn't only founded by African Americans, it was founded by whites and blacks, and that's something that was something new to me, and that's mostly what I'm discussing on my project for the Triumph and Tragedy.
My name is Katie Roosevelt, and I go to the school Somerset College Preparatory Academy, and my project is about the perfect storm. And the perfect storm is basically about a man which had his own crew, and they used to go fishing a lot, and then his crew basically quit on him, so he had to go out and find a new crew the next day, and there was a storm coming. So they went out and they went fishing in their town, which is Gloucester, and there wasn't a lot of fish there, so they decided to head out to Flemish Cap. And that's when 2 other storms started to brew up, and basically 3 of the storms collided together and their boat was stuck in the middle, so they lost their lives at sea. Well, it impacted people's lives because of the 6 men that lost their lives, and of how basically when you go out and you're a fisherman, you're taking risks because you don't know what's ever going to happen. So basically that's my project.
My name is Kevin LaLanne. I'm Cameron Bird, and we're from Palm Point. And our project is about Freddie Mercury and the triumphs and tragedies of his life, and how he's such a legend, and he is the prime time of music and rock and roll, and how he brought light to the AIDS Foundation, because at the time where he got AIDS, it was such a it was like a voodoo sentence. It was like, if you got AIDS, well, no one really cares, because it was a bad thing. And he brought light into it, the people that had AIDS, and it was okay. And now since he's passed away, he raised so much money for the AIDS Foundation. It's called Freddie Mercury Foundation, and it's to put money towards AIDS. And our board is based upon the Live Aid, and it is also like the most well-known concert. And like the concert is also like how it like connects to the AIDS Foundation.
My name is Valerie Collins.
My name's Erica Schmidt.
My name is Cassidy Lee, and we're from Fort Pierce Central. We're doing our project on the tragedy of blood diamonds and the triumph of the Kimberley process. Blood diamonds, also known as conflict diamonds, are basically diamonds used by rebel forces to fund their insurgencies and war efforts. And what they do with these diamonds is they force labor upon occupants of African countries to mine them day and night with their bare hands from rivers and streams, and using sifts to find the diamonds.
This picture shows where the blood diamonds originated. It originated in Sierra Leone. And this picture shows their slave work taking place, because a lot of kids and adults had the option of life or death, and they chose life, and the life choice involved slave work. And then this picture shows the 75,000, how do you say it? Deaths. And it shows where all the wars took place.
The whole triumph of it was the establishment of the Kimberley process, where Southern African diamond-producing states
met in Kimberley, South Africa, to help establish rules and regulations to help stop the funding and trading of conflict diamonds, also known as blood diamonds, to help stop the funding of the wars. And in 2003, it became official with the regulations and stuff, and it basically tracked the diamonds from start to finish and made sure they had proof of verification that they were conflict-free. And with the establishment of the Kimberley process, it significantly reduced the amount of conflicts and deaths involving the conflict diamonds and the mining of them illegal.
Hi, my name is Jai Howard, and I go to Somerset College Prep. And I did my project on Martin Luther King Jr., which inspired me by the day. And also, I would come here sometimes, and I would not see a Martin Luther King project board. And apparently, I did Triumph and Tragedy for him, and his triumph was because of his "I Have a Dream" speech. He accomplished of unsegregating everybody so they don't have any differences, and also so they don't have to get in fights always. And before he did that, he also did marches, peaceful marches, where policemen still argued with him and sent dogs wild at them so they can back out of the peaceful marches. And all that was because he was a Christian man, because he did not believe in any violence. And then his tragedy was that he was slain by a white man sniper, and it was across the way. The sniper was in a hotel that was across the street. And as soon as Martin Luther King Jr. got off the phone with his cousin, or maybe it was his brother, as soon as he got off the phone, he was sniped as soon as he stepped out his door. And everybody knew where the sniper bullet came from, so they pointed to the hotel and said, "Help, somebody help." And that is the day that he died, and also that really impacted the whole world. And the people he was inspired by was Rosa Parks, by her bus boycott, and also Gandhi, because he fested for a couple days. And then his wife also helped him through all this, and her name is Coretta Scott King. And they had 4 children together, and one of them is still alive today, and all the others are not authorized yet. And that one that we still know that is still alive today is Martin Luther King Jr. III. And then, as you see, I have his speech on the side and his famous picture up at the top. And then my famous quote from him is, "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great of a burden to bear."
Hi, my name is Lily Dowdy.
My name is Mariah Rivas, and we go to Southern Oaks Middle School. Okay, our project represents the theme Tragedy and Triumph.
Because the tragedy of the situation would be the two bombs that were detonated on August 5th, August 6th, 1945, and August 9th, 1945. They killed approximately 210,000 people on impact. The other tragedy would be that the other countries then led to more destruction due to nuclear weapons.
And the triumph of the atomic bomb would be that on August 15th, 1945, the Japanese surrendered from World War II, and on September 2nd, the official treaty was signed. Also, the scientific and military triumph led to more advanced nuclear weapons.
I'm Lilly Herndon.
And I'm Zara Chattery.
We're from Lincoln Park Academy, and we're in 6th grade. So we have the San Francisco earthquake and fire rising from the ruins. So based off our title, you can tell that triumph and tragedy is very clear, because the earthquake and fire, when you first think of it, it isn't very appealing in a triumph way. But we later realized that the information we learned about the Andres Fault Line, which is a line that runs down the coast of California, is very unsturdy and just structurally weak. And a lot of houses were built on that before the earthquake occurred. And also the tectonic plates, we had no idea of that until this sad and tragic natural disaster happened. We also know that we now avoid building on fault lines, soft soil, building codes are way stronger, and our infrastructure is just very strong and way more sturdy for these type of natural disasters. We also were not prepared for this situation because we didn't know anything about earthquakes, and we didn't know when they're going to happen or how to tell when one was going to start.
The earthquake lasted 45 to 60 seconds. It was rated on the scale 8 or 9, so moderate to heavy damage. And the fire lasted much longer than it could have because all the water mains broke from the city, and the firefighters weren't able to put them out right away. So they lasted for about 3 or 4 days. And our board shows how some of the buildings were before and after the earthquake, and how many people died, and how that some of the fires were started from like electrical wires and lamps.
We also at the time Europe and Japan had way more knowledge than we did, and this natural disaster helped us catch up to their knowledge. And living in Florida, we can now apply that to like Matthew or Andrew hurricanes, and how we also can relate how our buildings and how our houses were now built way differently. For example, my personal house was built way different than hers, which is just recently built, and how we can see how natural disasters like an earthquake or a tornado maybe or hurricane can differ how our knowledge and how much we gain, and the different ways houses and buildings look and are just like built way differently.
And people learned, now we know not to build on like fault lines or soft soil, and we build our houses and buildings out of different woods, and things are much stronger. And then we have like laws that will show whether or not we have laws that make sure that our buildings and our infrastructures are stronger. And there's so much, like she was saying, there's so much of a difference between modern houses nowadays and back then. So it really shows how much we have improved, how we build things, and how much we've learned.
We also know that tectonic plates, as I said earlier, are a big part of the earthquake, and that's how continents are made, and how when the tectonic plates move, that's what causes the earthquake. And we had no knowledge on that before this disaster happened, and our knowledge has gained through this tragic experience.
And our city and San Francisco was brought so much closer together because they had to rebuild everything, and it took them forever to make their city for what it is, and it was all destroyed in a matter of minutes. And it brought them closer together when they had to work as a community to rebuild all of their buildings and make sure all the roads were much more safer, and it brought them all closer together.
That's all we have.
Okay, my name is Justin Bernal, and I go to school at Westgate K-8 school. And here's my board of the 1715 Spanish fleet. And the 1715 Spanish fleet was a historical fleet, and they were headed from Havana, Cuba, towards Spain to steal tons and millions of gold and silver and religious relics and food and water and all that that you need to survive. And while they were on their way back from Spain to go back to Cuba, a huge, massive hurricane hit right where they were at, and the waves got big. They destroyed 11 out of the 12 ships, and 1,500 men and women died during that. Only one ship made it back to Havana, Cuba, and I believe the triumph and tragedy is, the triumph is if all of the 12 ships made it back, it would have built up all of the colonies, and they would have had a bigger army with all the money and the gold and stuff. they would have had a bigger army. They would have passed it on to the next generations to build up the next generation's colony. And the tragedy is when the 11 out of the 12 ships sank. Ships that were on their way were called galleons. They lost indigo, gold, silver, a bunch of other materials, food, water, chocolate, all that to need to survive. And also, here are some of the names of the ships that they found. And then there are 4 ships that they have not found. Here are some of the coins and the necklaces. And here are some of the illustrations of what it looked like when the waves hit and they crashed into rocks right under the sea level. And here is one of the demonstration of what a ship would look like that they were on their way to Cuba and Spain. Here are some of the crash sites that they found of the ships. And then here's the map of the area where the ship sank, and they sank right off of the coastline in 15 feet of water.